Picture this, if you will. Hugh Glass drags his shredded body across Wyoming's Badlands in November 1823, leaving a crimson trail that freezes within seconds of touching snow. Now, I want you to really think about what this means. We're not talking about some mild winter inconvenience here. We're talking about temperatures that drop past -40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the kind of cold where your breath doesn't just mist, it crystallizes and falls to the ground like tiny daggers of ice. The grizzly's claws have opened his back like a map of pain. To put this in perspective, imagine someone taking a garden rake, not a little hand rake, but one of those heavy-duty landscaping rakes with steel tines, and dragging it across your back with the force of a small automobile. That's what grizzly claws do. They don't just scratch, they excavate. And now Glass is crawling through this white hell where simply breathing feels like swallowing razor blades. But here's where our story takes a turn that changes everything. In this wasteland, where death seems as certain as sunrise, Glass stumbles into something that should not exist, an abandoned shelter that defies every law of frontier survival he's ever learned. It's not a cabin, it's not a lean-to. It's a strange earthen mound with walls that seem to breathe warmth into the killing cold. What Glass has discovered, though he doesn't know it yet, is the Crow Nation's most guarded secret. This chance discovery will transform winter survival across the American frontier. We're talking about a revolution in human survival technology that predates our modern understanding of thermal dynamics by 2 centuries. Inside this shelter, what the Shoshone would call the Earth's winter womb, 3 distinct layers work together like a living organism. Think of it as nature's own thermos bottle, but engineered with a sophistication that would make modern architects pause and take notes. The outer shell consists of packed snow. Now, before you say, "Wait a minute, snow is cold," remember that fresh snow is actually one of nature's best insulators. It's mostly air, and air, when trapped, becomes a thermal barrier. The middle layer creates what engineers today would recognize as a dead airspace. This buffer zone between the outer shell and inner chamber creates thermal breaks that prevent heat transfer. It's the same principle we use in modern double-pane windows, except these indigenous architects figured it out when Europeans were still huddling around smoky fires in drafty castles. The inner chamber is lined with pine boughs arranged in patterns that maximize both insulation and air circulation. Pine needles contain natural oils that release a subtle warmth when body heat activates them. But here's the genius part. The entire structure is designed to capture and recirculate body heat while preventing the deadly carbon dioxide buildup that kills so many winter shelter occupants. This MAD, shelter, mounded air trap design, as frontier scholars would later term it, represents indigenous engineering at its most sophisticated. While Glass crawls inside, more dead than alive, 17 other trappers are freezing solid in traditional lean-tos that very week. These men, experienced frontiersmen who pride themselves on wilderness survival, are dying in shelters they consider adequate. Meanwhile, Glass sleeps as warm as a summer morning. To understand the scale of what's happening here, consider this. The traditional frontier survival rate during severe winter storms hovers around 30%. That means 7 out of 10 men caught in conditions like these simply don't make it home. But indigenous peoples using MAD shelter technology achieve survival rates exceeding 90% in identical conditions. We're not talking about minor improvements. We're talking about the difference between probable death and almost certain survival. Glass doesn't understand the science, but his body responds to the shelter's sophisticated thermal management. As he lies there, barely conscious, the structure performs its ancient function. The outer snow layer provides wind protection, while the air gaps prevent heat conduction. The pine needle lining releases aromatic oils that have mild antibiotic properties, important when you're nursing wounds that would normally become infected in the field. What Glass experiences over the next 3 days will plant seeds for a revolution that spreads across the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Word of his miraculous survival begins circulating through rendezvous camps and trading posts. Mountain men start asking uncomfortable questions about their own shelter techniques. Why are white men dying when indigenous knowledge offers better solutions? But Glass's discovery represents more than just individual survival. It's the beginning of a knowledge transfer that will save thousands of lives and reshape how Americans approach winter wilderness survival. The MAD shelter design, refined over countless generations by indigenous engineers, is about to enter the broader American consciousness. As Glass recovers his strength in this remarkable shelter, he's unknowingly positioned at the center of a collision between two worlds of knowledge. The European-American approach to frontier survival, brute force construction using axes and lumber, meets indigenous technological sophistication that works with natural systems rather than fighting them. And here's what makes this moment so crucial to American history. Glass isn't just any trapper. He's a storyteller, a man whose dramatic survival tales will spread through every trading post from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. His account of the shelter that saved his life will reach the ears of men who matter, brigade leaders, company organizers, territorial officials. What happens next will determine whether this indigenous innovation remains a closely guarded tribal secret or becomes the foundation for a revolution in American frontier survival. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're talking about knowledge that could triple survival rates during the harshest conditions nature can deliver. But first, Glass has to survive long enough to tell his story. January 1835, Wind River Territory. Chief Washakie of the Shoshone sits across from Jim Bridger in a ceremonial lodge where sweet grass smoke mingles with the scent of brewing pine needle tea. But this isn't some romanticized Hollywood meeting of cultures. This is a business negotiation with life and death stakes, conducted between two men who understand exactly what's at risk. Bridger's fingers are frost-blackened. Not just cold, we're talking about the early stages of frostbite that will cost him 2 fingertips if something doesn't change soon. The man who mapped more of the American West than Lewis and Clark is about to lose parts of his hands to winter's bite. And Washakie sees this. The chief sees another white man about to pay the price for ignoring knowledge that could save his life. Now, here's what makes this moment extraordinary. Washakie isn't just any tribal leader. This is a man who speaks English, French, and 4 native languages fluently. He's negotiated with territorial governors and army generals. He understands both worlds, the indigenous knowledge systems that have sustained his people for centuries, and the European-American hunger for expansion that's reshaping the continent. The decision Washakie makes in this moment will ripple across American history. He's about to share the MAD shelter knowledge, the most closely guarded survival secret of the Wind River Shoshone. But this comes with a price that goes far beyond simple commerce. Washakie wants trading rights through Wind River territory and 50 rifles for his warriors. But more than that, he wants something that white negotiators rarely offer: respect for the knowledge itself. Think about the calculations running through Washakie's mind. These MAD shelters represent generations of accumulated wisdom. Indigenous engineers spent centuries perfecting thermal dynamics that European science won't formally understand for another 50 years. Sharing this knowledge means potentially saving hundreds of white lives. But it also means giving away technological advantages that have kept his people alive in conditions that kill outsiders. Washakie remembers his grandmother's prophecies about the time when all peoples would need earth wisdom to survive what she called the coming cold. She spoke of winters that would test every human on the continent, regardless of their origins. Looking at Bridger's blackened fingers, Washakie sees her words taking shape in flesh and bone. The knowledge transfer takes 3 full days of careful instruction. This isn't casual camping advice. This is precision engineering taught through hands-on demonstration. Young Shoshone boys, some no older than 12, serve as teaching assistants. These children can read snow density like modern meteorologists read weather maps. They understand thermal gradients, air circulation patterns, and structural engineering principles that won't appear in American textbooks for decades. Day 1 focuses on site selection. The boys demonstrate how to read the land for thermal sweet spots where Earth's natural heat rises closest to the surface. They teach Bridger to feel for updrafts with his hands, to recognize the subtle soil variations that indicate geothermal activity. This isn't mystical knowledge, it's applied geology. The Shoshone have been conducting thermal surveys of their territory for generations. Day 2 covers construction techniques. The wall angles that deflect wind while trapping warm air follow mathematical principles that engineers today call fluid dynamics. The entrance positioning relative to cardinal directions isn't spiritual symbolism. It's sophisticated understanding of prevailing wind patterns and solar positioning. Every element serves multiple functions in an integrated system. But here's where cultural collision creates catastrophe. Bridger's first attempt fails spectacularly. Not just fails, it nearly kills him. He ignores the spiritual protocols, placing the entrance facing the wrong cardinal direction because it seems more convenient. He skips the purification ceremony because it strikes him as primitive superstition. His shelter collapses in the first strong wind, trapping him in what becomes essentially a snow coffin. The rescue comes at dawn, when Shoshone searchers find Bridger barely conscious, suffering from carbon dioxide poisoning and severe hypothermia. They don't say, "I told you so." They don't lecture him about respecting indigenous wisdom. They simply treat his condition and wait for him to understand what went wrong. This is the moment when Jim Bridger, the man who found the Great Salt Lake, who mapped the Oregon Trail, who considered himself master of the Western wilderness, kneels before Shoshone wisdom and asks to learn properly. The purification ceremony isn't about religious conversion, it's about approaching the earth as a living teacher rather than a resource to be conquered. Bridger's second attempt follows every protocol. He participates in the ceremonies, he acknowledges the cardinal directions. He builds according to specifications that initially seem unnecessarily complex. The result holds through a 72-hour blizzard with winds reaching 80 miles per hour, conditions that would have killed him in any conventional shelter. That same storm becomes a natural experiment in survival technology. The American Fur Company has 43 men scattered across the region in traditional lean-tos and log shelters. When the blizzard passes, 18 of them are dead. That's a 43% mortality rate. Meanwhile, Bridger emerges from his MAD shelter not just alive, but comfortable enough to have maintained a journal throughout the storm. The psychological impact on surviving trappers is profound. These are men who stake their reputations on wilderness expertise. They've spent years perfecting shelter techniques passed down from European traditions. Suddenly, they're confronted with evidence that indigenous methods aren't just different, they're superior. The cognitive dissonance creates a crisis of confidence that spreads through every trading post and rendezvous point. Word travels fast in the tight-knit world of Rocky Mountain fur traders. By spring rendezvous, every major brigade leader has heard about Bridger's miraculous survival. The story grows in the telling, but the core facts remain undeniable. Traditional shelters killed nearly half the men caught in that storm, while the MAD shelter kept its occupants safe and warm. Washakie watches this cultural shift with the satisfaction of a man who has planted seeds for the future. The trading agreements are secondary to the larger transformation. He's initiated a knowledge transfer that will save thousands of lives across the American frontier. But more importantly, he's demonstrated that indigenous wisdom deserves respect rather than dismissal. The stage is now set for a confrontation that will determine whether this revolutionary survival technology spreads across the American frontier or remains confined to those few mountain men wise enough to abandon their cultural prejudices. Because the American Fur Company's accountants are about to calculate exactly what ignorance costs in human lives and corporate profits. February 1838 brings the worst weather in Rocky Mountain memory. Snow falls continuously for 21 days, while temperatures never rise above -20 degrees Fahrenheit. To put this in modern terms, imagine Chicago during its worst blizzard, then make it 3 times longer and twice as cold. This isn't just harsh winter weather. This is nature declaring war on human survival. The American Fur Company's accountants, sitting in their comfortable street, Louis offices, calculate losses at $30,000 per month as trappers die faster than they can be replaced. Now, $30,000 in 1838 equals roughly $1 million today. We're not talking about minor business setbacks. We're talking about corporate hemorrhaging that threatens the entire Western fur trade. But here's where business desperation creates historical opportunity. At Rendezvous Point, Brigade leader Thomas Fitzpatrick faces a crisis that demands radical solutions. Half his men are already dead or missing. The other half huddle in shelters that are essentially elaborate suicide chambers. Fitzpatrick makes a decision that will reshape American wilderness survival. He organizes the Great Shelter Trial. This isn't some academic experiment. This is a survival contest with real stakes. Leadership of the spring trapping territories. The winners get the best beaver streams. The losers get buried in shallow graves when the ground thaws. Fitzpatrick divides his remaining men into two camps: traditional builders versus MAD advocates. Each group must construct their shelters and survive whatever nature throws at them. The traditional camp brings generations of European woodcraft knowledge to bear. They build sturdy log lean-tos, reinforced with buffalo hides, using techniques perfected in Scandinavian forests and Canadian logging camps. These structures represent the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Northern European survival. They look solid. They feel secure. They inspire confidence in men who've spent their lives trusting axes and muscle over indigenous innovation. Meanwhile, mad builders work through the night creating their triple-layer earth lodges. To traditional trappers watching this construction, it looks like elaborate dirt play. Where Europeans see sophisticated engineering, frontier pragmatists see overcomplicated nonsense. The psychological divide runs deeper than construction techniques. It's about fundamental worldviews regarding humanity's relationship with nature. When the storm hits with 100-mile-per-hour winds, the traditional shelters become death traps. The gaps that seemed minor during construction now whistle with killing cold. Buffalo hides that provided adequate insulation in normal conditions prove worthless against sustained sub-zero assault. Log walls that appeared solid crack and separate as wood contracts in the extreme cold. Inside Jedediah Smith's MAD shelter, 19 men survive 6 weeks of siege conditions as wolf packs, drawn by the scent of weakness and desperation, circle the traditional camps where men slowly freeze. The psychological warfare intensifies as mad inhabitants sing and tell stories in their warm chambers, while traditional shelter survivors huddle in silence, conserving energy for what they believe will be their final hours. Think about the crushing irony here. The wolves understand something the traditional trappers don't. They can smell death approaching in those log shelters. Animals with brains the size of walnuts demonstrate better survival instincts than experienced frontiersmen, armed with axes, rifles, and European construction techniques. The sound differences tell the entire story. From the MAD shelters comes laughter, conversation, even occasional singing. These men are comfortable enough to maintain morale and social cohesion. From the traditional shelters comes increasingly rare signs of life: weak voices calling for help, desperate arguments about resource allocation, and eventually, the terrible silence that indicates hypothermia's final stages. Week 3 brings the psychological breaking point. Traditional shelter survivors begin abandoning their structures and crawling toward the MAD shelters, begging for admission. These proud frontiersmen, men who've faced down grizzly bears and hostile war parties, prostrate themselves in the snow and plead for indigenous wisdom they previously dismissed as primitive superstition. The MAD shelter inhabitants face an agonizing decision. Their shelters can accommodate additional people, but only if resources are carefully managed. Admitting desperate refugees means reducing everyone's chances of survival, yet leaving fellow Americans to freeze violates every frontier code of mutual assistance. The decision they make reveals character under ultimate pressure. They open their shelters, not from naive generosity, but from calculated assessment that shared body heat and combined resources improve everyone's survival odds. The indigenous engineering proves robust enough to sustain larger populations than originally planned. The MAD shelter design includes scalability that European construction lacks. By spring, the results speak with statistical brutality. Every traditional shelter occupant who remained in their original structures died. 100% mortality. Meanwhile, the MAD shelters maintain 97% survival rates, despite overcrowding and extended siege conditions. The Great Shelter Trial becomes the most decisive survival technology demonstration in American frontier history. The corporate response follows immediately. Every major fur company mandates MAD shelter training before the next trapping season. The Hudson's Bay Company offers double wages for guides who can teach indigenous construction techniques. The Wyoming Territorial Government establishes $10 bounties for verified MAD shelter locations along major trails, essentially creating America's first winter survival infrastructure program. But the deeper transformation goes beyond corporate policy. The Great Shelter Trial shatters European-American assumptions about technological superiority. Men who considered themselves masters of wilderness survival admit that indigenous knowledge systems surpass their own traditional methods. This represents a fundamental shift in cultural consciousness that will influence American attitudes toward native wisdom for generations. The Mad Shelter Revolution is about to leap beyond the fur trade into the broader American experience. California gold seekers, railroad workers, and military expeditions will soon discover what a few mountain men learned through bitter necessity. Indigenous wisdom, once dismissed as primitive superstition, is about to save thousands of American lives and reshape how a nation approaches its harshest frontiers. The Mad Shelter's influence spreads like ripples across time, touching lives in ways its indigenous creators never imagined. September 1846. South Pass, Wyoming. The Donnelly wagon train, 300 settlers bound for California dreams, finds itself trapped by a September blizzard that transforms their covered wagons into canvas coffins. Mary Donnelly's diary captures the miracle of watching Shoshone scouts teaching desperate mothers to build earth wombs for their children while oxen freeze standing up in their traces. Picture this scene. Women who've never built anything more complex than a quilting frame are suddenly constructing sophisticated thermal shelters under indigenous instruction. Children who were crying from cold an hour earlier are now playing games inside warm earthen chambers. The psychological transformation is as dramatic as the physical salvation. These aren't just survival shelters, they're hope made manifest in snow and soil. The California Gold Rush sees 10,000 MAD shelters dotting the Sierra Nevada like thermal oases in a frozen desert. 49ers who mock native wisdom during the summer months become desperate students when winter storms trap them at 9,000 feet elevation. The knowledge spreads through mining camps with the urgency of men who understand that ignorance equals death. Union Pacific work crews reduce winter casualties by 70%, using modified industrial versions of MAD shelter design. Railroad executives, initially skeptical of indigenous engineering, become converts when their accountants calculate the savings. Dead workers don't lay track. Mad shelters keep crews alive and productive through conditions that previously shut down construction for entire seasons. Military adoption begins during the Mexican-American War, when General Kearny's Mountain Division survives the San Juan blizzard of 1847 using captured native shelter plans. Army engineers, trained to respect Roman military architecture and European fortress design, grudgingly admit that Shoshone thermal engineering surpasses anything in their West Point textbooks. By 1890, West Point includes mandatory MAD shelter construction in winter survival training. Cadets who will command troops from Alaska to the Philippines learn indigenous techniques alongside cavalry tactics and artillery, mathematics. The knowledge that once belonged exclusively to native nations becomes standard curriculum for America's military elite. But the design reaches its ultimate vindication in 1914, when Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic expedition survives, using principles learned from a Cree guide who inherited the knowledge through 7 generations from the original Shoshone teachers. Think about this lineage. Wisdom developed in Wyoming Badlands saves British explorers trapped in Antarctic ice. Indigenous knowledge proves more durable than European empires. Modern analysis reveals the MAD shelter's true genius. The triple-layer design creates temperature differentials up to 60 degrees Fahrenheit while using only natural materials available in wilderness conditions. NASA engineers studying the structures for potential Mars habitat applications describe them as examples of biomimetic architecture that surpasses many contemporary designs. Today's homeless advocacy groups build urban MAD variants in cities from Seattle to Minneapolis. These modern adaptations use cardboard and plastic sheeting instead of pine boughs and buffalo hide, but the fundamental thermal principles remain unchanged. Indigenous wisdom from the 1820s provides solutions for 21st-century urban survival. Climate scientists study the indigenous knowledge that let humans thrive where nature said they should die. As global warming paradoxically creates more extreme winter weather events, researchers recognize that native thermal engineering offers sustainable alternatives to energy-intensive heating systems. The MAD shelter design requires zero fossil fuels while maintaining comfortable interior temperatures. The mountain men who once scorned native knowledge became its greatest champions, their journals filled with reverent descriptions of the Earth's warm embrace. Jim Bridger's later writings read like love letters to Shoshone engineering. Men who conquered wilderness, through brute force, learned to survive through partnership with natural systems. Hugh Glass, whose desperate crawl into that first MAD shelter started this revolution, lived to see indigenous wisdom transform American frontier survival. His later expeditions always included native guides, not as curiosities or translators, but as essential technical experts whose knowledge meant the difference between expedition success and catastrophic failure. The transformation goes beyond survival statistics, remarkable as those are. The MAD shelter revolution forced American culture to confront uncomfortable truths about technological superiority and cultural prejudice. When your life depends on knowledge you've dismissed as primitive superstition, intellectual humility becomes a survival skill. Emergency management agencies across the northern United States now include MAD shelter principles in disaster preparedness protocols. When power grids fail and heating systems collapse, the thermal coming grids start. Engineering developed by indigenous peoples centuries ago provides backup systems that require no external energy sources or technological infrastructure. The legacy echoes through modern survival training from military special forces to civilian wilderness programs. Instructors teach the same principles Chief Washakie shared with Jim Bridger. Respect the earth as a living teacher, work with natural systems rather than fighting them, and understand that true expertise often comes from unexpected sources. What started as one man's desperate discovery in a Wyoming blizzard became a revolution that saved thousands of lives and challenged fundamental assumptions about progress and civilization. The MAD shelter story demonstrates that the most sophisticated technologies aren't always the newest ones. Sometimes wisdom comes from sources that dominant cultures prefer to ignore. In our modern world of climate-controlled buildings and GPS navigation, it's easy to forget that human survival once depended entirely on reading natural signs and working with environmental forces. The MAD shelter reminds us that indigenous knowledge systems preserved essential wisdom that technological societies abandon at their peril. The Earth's warm embrace, as those mountain men learned to call it, remains available to anyone humble enough to learn from teachers whose classrooms have no walls and whose textbooks are written in snow, soil, and stone. Sometimes the most advanced technology is also the most ancient wisdom.